It's KR King of D&D Homebrew, talking today about using humor in your world. I think this is an important question because we are playing the game, an RPG game, to have fun. And humor in a game can really add fun, but too much humor can take away the seriousness that makes us want to invest the time in these characters and these situations. So I'm going to identify here three basic tenets, I think, of using humor in your game. And the first is the overall ethos or vibe of your world. Is it one that is humorous, or is it one that's deadly serious, or somewhere in between? The second one is, are there humorous NPCs or humorous situations in-game in the world that the players are inhabiting such that there is comic relief from the serious dangers and consequences and storylines of your world? And then finally, there is the player to player or player to GM humor, the sort of metagame humor that you create within your group, in jokes or situations or commentaries on your world, and how much should you have those to maintain that serious level. So when we think about the vibe of a world, there's sometimes a temptation for people to say, I want to have a grim world, a mudcore. It's kill or be killed. There's, the terrain is very sort of dark and foreboding, the way that people act, sort of like Barovia or something like that, where one can't imagine anyone cracking a joke. This may be your preferred, you and your players love this. I think this is a bit of a mistake. I think you need to have some humor in your world. But the opposite end is silly world where nothing makes sense. And I guess what I would use is movie examples. So just conventional movies, let's say the world of Anchorman, if you've seen those, or any Will Ferrell movies. While they track the real world in terms of this Anchorman at a TV station, we know from the get-go it's not a real world. Up to where situations like when they have this big fight between the different anchormen and stuff, you just get that it's kind of a silly world, right? It tracks the real world, but it's silly. On the opposite side, you have, if you remember the old Ingmar Bergman movies like Persona or something, or Autumn Sonata, very serious dramas, not an ounce of humor. War movies can be this way if they don't have any kind of comic relief. I think Dunkirk I didn't see any jokes in there that I remember, because war is a serious business. So you have those two ends of the spectrum. Where do you want to fall in between in terms of the world that you're creating, like a movie world? Let's look at fantasy movies just to narrow this down. The classic silly fantasy is Monty Python and the Holy Grail. I know it's a movie from long ago, but if you've ever seen it, everything about it is silly and ridiculous, but it tracks a medieval storyline, the search for the Holy Grail, the chivalry and knights and all this sort of stuff. But none of it is to be taken seriously. As opposed, I guess I'm thinking of, there's a movie, The 13th Warrior, if you've ever seen that. Very serious, not a lot of jokes. There's not magic in that world per se, but it still is of that era. And the very grimcore type world, how do you want to fall in terms of if you're running a fantasy RPG? And, let's use Lord of the Rings, too, because Lord of the Rings, I think, is a good example in that it's a very serious topic. Sauron is an evil person. The situation is dire, and yet there's a lot of humor. You have humorous characters, Merry and Pippin, constantly providing comic relief, from the Bilbo's birthday party to, with the Ents, or, when they're on the run from the ringwraiths and all that. And you have Gimli and Legolas having this comic banter between each other in terms of killing victims in there, the elves and the dwarves having issues and all this stuff. And there's other moments where the grim, circumstances are broken by a little bit of comic relief. And I think you can use that as an example of the vibe of a world. You don't necessarily have to have a heroic fantasy world. It can be a very low magic, grimcore, mudcore, whatever you want to call it, world. Or as an example, when I played the White Box days or AD&D, we had all sorts of humorous situations, humorous characters in our world, even though it was always a very kind of brutal world in terms of characters dying. Because again, the ethos is to have fun. So in terms of that vibe, I would say, like when I run a world, let's say I have Monty Python here and that 13th Warrior, something really serious, you can probably think of some. I'm about here. I'm not too far into the silliness, but I have comic relief, comic situations, and I promote at the table a spirit in which we're having fun and we can come up with humorous commentaries on what's happening. And, we're not going to take this too seriously. We're going to, especially when the players do things that are, humorous in retrospect. Which leads us to humorous NPCs, monsters, and situations in your world that you create. I had this character in my last 5e, Benny the Weasel, basically based on Benny from the Mummy movies, if you remember him. And he was both this sleazy guy who came up with stuff, schemes and whatnot, a lot of which didn't pan out, or he was always lying to the players. But he would get himself into trouble. He would get himself into humorous situations with the players. I also had an Etten, an arguing pair of Etten that were sort of comic relief. And I had some other characters that were there, wisecracking, or situations where the players would then play along and have a fun situation. Because even in the grimmest, or perhaps because it's the grimmest of a medieval situation in a village or something, people are going to make jokes. They're going to try to break the monotony and grimness with humor. So I would always have those kind of comic relief characters that are there. And what happens when you have a humorous NPC is the players will lighten up slightly. They will then perhaps role play or do something that reflects that humor, that little bit of silliness, not too silly, right? And if you take a comic relief NPC and you start slapping them around, they're going to get mad. They're going to act like a real person, right? Because the situation of the world, as I said, in terms of our spectrum, it's not over here in Monty Python or Anchorman or something where ridiculous things can sort of go on and we don't pay any attention. We just keep moving forward. No, there's going to be a reaction to those. But you're always promoting the fun at the table. And what happens if it's just unrelentingly grim, that can leak into people's enthusiasm. Because there is nothing that revives the spirit more at a table when everyone is laughing, or even online, when everyone's having a chuckle over some situation or some NPC that they have interacted with, and then sort of taken that situation and ran with it in a humorous, especially a role playing, or when it's not some critical situation. Although I had like a housemaid, if you remember, there's a character in The Bride of Frankenstein, the 30s edition, this goofy maid, and I sort of inserted her into this castle environment the players were sneaking in, and they started role-playing with her to fool her into doing something for them, and her humorous sort of bird brain, personality, but then at the last, she was shrewd as well. She had survived in this, a warlord's castle, came through in a way that they told me later was very realistic in terms of her finally going, wait, what's going on? But the players had a lot of laughs dealing with her and playing off her comic persona in this very serious situation. If you can, it's a fine balance, but if you can do that, it really adds, I would say, is it verisimilitude? Probably not. Probably that's the situation. If you remember the old TV show Law and Order, where every cab driver and parking lot attendant and every person had a snappy comeback for everything, right? They just, because they had this one line in the show and they always made it that way. People are not that way in real life. And this maid was, I think we meet characters, right, that, in the world, people that are stand out from the masses with their personality. So that's what this is. And again, it just makes your world more fun. And when the players do things that are goofy, we had a player years ago jump out, got through a window, went out and landed in the courtyard. I rolled randomly. I said, what is it going to be, 25% chance you roll in the pig pigsty over here. And I said, high or low, and they rolled right in it. And they were covered in pig, what. And all through the rest of this thing, I had characters reacting to the smell and the sight. And this player took it on and lived it up and did all this stuff. And another situation, I had this character that was being held and unjustly charged, and they decided to act crazy. And so they took off all their clothes in the courtroom. They did all sorts of goofy things. And it was very humorous the way this was done, the reaction of the judge and the bailiff and whatnot. So the players can contribute to those situations. As I say, once the player falls into the pigsty, then he ran with that. Once the player was faced, what am I going to do in this in a role play? They decided to act crazy or goofy or whatever. Now, what you don't want to do is overwhelm this, or for me, just personally, I don't like vamping when players start to either, go too far with this kind of thing or want to keep going or want to keep inserting this beyond its application to the situation at hand. And that leads us to the third situation, which is player to player or player to GM, the metagame sort of banter that goes on, where if you have a humorous situation that's evolving and a player is getting attention, they start to just do this a lot to become the center of attention, or that you break the concentration on the game and people start to, talk about this out of game or start looking on their phones for memes or for this or that because you've kind of allowed a humorous situation to occur. So you need to keep things serious to some extent, unless that's the game you want, right? It's just not the game I want. But I want the players to have fun. I want them to, if there is a humorous situation that comes out of their actions, I don't mind a little, table talk about that. Because really what happens is after the game, when you're discussing situations and different actions of the players, when the player was covered in all this pig stuff, and they were doing all these actions, that becomes a story that you tell later about what went down. And that's really fun. And then you can have running gags with a player if they're always, jumping out a window. Where are they going to land now? Again, as long as it all makes sense, it doesn't become like a running gag that wears out its welcome. But this is what humor does. This is what having this collective fun does. You've seen this, if you read it in stories or whatever, a group comes together as a team, like a group in a RPG setting. They have inside jokes. They have running gag. They have situations that they all remember. They develop nicknames and things like that based upon their actions. Now, I'm not saying you want to force that on the players, but it's certainly, if it happens and the players do something, jumping in the pigsty, then other NPCs in your world have heard of this and refer to this, right? This becomes their nickname. I have a player in a current campaign who, punched someone in the face. He's a cleric, the preacher man, and he became known as this guy, the two-fisted preacher man, right? And that becomes your reputation, and it's done in a humorous way. You don't, if the player doesn't like it or whatever, you just can drop it. But the point is that this humorous banter that occurs in the real world with people in a situation like this adds a little verisimilitude, but also adds fun, because ultimately the thing about humor is something that we do to deal with the hardships of life, to show our affection for other people. It doesn't all have to be cruel humor. It can be humor that talks about the joy of life or talks about that we're all in this situation together, right? It builds solidarity because of, the sort of absurdity of life or whatever it is. And finally, humor, putting a smile on your face, that's what we're going for when we're playing an RPG. So in terms of setting the tone for your world, the vibe, part of that's going to come from the NPCs, the comic relief or the situations. Part of it's going to come from not, your players are doing this, player to player, making these situations up, but you too, as I said, reacting to what they do to create a vibe in your world that even if you have the ultimate low magic, just no low technology, everyone's on the edge of extinction all the time, but there's humor there. There's fun. There's situations that everyone laughs. Everyone has a good time. That is going to increase the fun of playing that game in that Grimcore world or a high fantasy superheroic world. If you have running gags there too, right? Where they're making fun of each other, the Dudley Do-Right Paladin or whatever it is, that increases the fun. And that's what we're going for. And of course, a shout out to all my Patreons. This week I did a bridge map talking about bridges. I got some more great stuff coming up this week. Thank you all for your support. And thank you for watching my video. If you like what you see, please subscribe, give a like. I'd love to have comments on you. How much humor do you use in your world? And most importantly, keep playing an RPG game, whichever one you choose, and tell somebody else about it.